Welcome to Learning by Association, a podcast brought to you by D2L, where we delve into the ever-evolving world of associations and the challenges they face in navigating the currents of change. I'm Bill Sheehan, and I'm thrilled to be your host. Join me and our guests as we explore the role learning plays in driving associations forward and how it can impact every part of your organization, from recruiting to engagement and renewals to staff development, business strategy, and more. So let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Learning by Association. I'm Bill Sheehan, Global Head of Association Strategy for D2L. And today we're fortunate, honored, and blessed to have Patti Montague from the School Nutrition Association. Patti's the CEO and has been involved with the School Nutrition Association for a while. And Patti, it would be a disservice if I tried to give you an introduction. If you could just give us an introduction, a little bit about your history there with SNA, that would be great.
Sure, Bill, it's great to be with you today. So actually, I will be with the organization 34 years come June 1st, which I know is very strange in the world of associations and most jobs today. But, I joined the organization just as I was starting to have kids. And my School Nutrition Association, I have 50,000 members who feed students across the country, 30 million school lunches every day, 15 school breakfasts. And a lot has changed in school nutrition. I've grown the organization. I've grown, moved up from being a director to a VP to the COO and eventually the CEO. And, I could go anywhere and do what I do, conferences, advocacy, websites, communications, but it's a great mission and great people and a great purpose in feeding the youth of America. So yeah. I have no regret.
And you've done a great job, Patti. I've known you for a while. In fact, way back in the day when I first got my start, or probably around this time you did, I was with the National Confectioners Association.
Now, I remember that.
Right. Yeah. So that School Nutrition National Confectioner sometimes wasn't always the easiest transition, but I've seen that organization grow and be so innovative and kind of be, really the voice of the school nutrition industry and its impact. And you've done a remarkable job. You've been through it all, and you've seen so many changes that have happened, in the association space and having to adapt so quickly. We've seen the advent of the internet and social media. Now it's AI and so forth. And I remember back in the day when the fax machine was the greatest use of technology. And so it's been a very, very interesting ride, and congratulations on a remarkable career. I know you're still doing great things there at SNA.
Thank you.
So thanks again for being on the show. Just from your perspective, I know you and I travel quite a bit. You participate in other association events outside of School Nutrition Association. And just from your perspective, what are you seeing? Like, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities that are facing associations today? And how is School Nutrition Association kind of adapting and trying to stay ahead on that?
Sure. So I'd like to say, where do we begin with the challenges? I think, coming out of the pandemic, which we all know is very challenging, I think all of us were hoping that it was going to get easier. But I think anyone you speak today, you read every article and every paper, it's all about challenges every business is facing today, right? But for associations, I think one area of a challenge is membership, and I think I saw something like 48 to 50% of associations saw a decrease in membership. We saw a decrease because people weren't going to school, because we're in schools, right? They basically, in America, you shut down schools for a year and a half. And so many people that are working in the school environment, maybe we had some older members who didn't want to expose themselves to, because our members started feeding kids right away, right? Mm-hmm. Everything closed down on Friday, and Monday they were at curbside feeding. But our membership, bounced back. It's the directors, the people who are running, administering the programs, but where we're seeing staffing challenges our members are facing because of the turnover. There's not enough people for those lower paying jobs. If you go into your local town and you look at all the service businesses that are out there in our service economy, and we're competing with that. So how do you ensure that there's enough people to work in the field, and the constant need to retrain? So for us to retrain our members because of that, obviously all associations, the business model needs to change. We used to publish a magazine 11 times a year and made $2 million in print advertising. Well, that plummeted like everyone else. So, we switched and focused on digital, and I'm very proud to say we still publish a magazine. Not a lot of associations do that, but we went to 6 times a year, and it's still going strong. But we're trying to continue to innovate in those ways. One of the biggest challenges I think many are facing is that a lot of for-profit companies are now trying to replicate what associations have done because of technology. And so that's a challenge. And sometimes, how do you explain that to someone? Like when you do stuff for, if you sponsor something or do from the association, we use that money to reinvest in the members. But, there's so many out there that are doing it. And so that's a big challenge. But again, we are trying to keep up, and by, implementing technology, looking at revising our membership model, constantly looking at what we need to do to be able to competitive and serve our members, because they're facing many challenges just like everyone else, every other business. So, and adapting to that, I think it's critical to the survival of associations today.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head that this whole new technology and kind of it's a very hyper competitive market now for all associations, right? They're competing against companies, particularly in the learning space. They're competing with companies as that's all they do is learning, and they want to provide it to your members. Whereas you have other things you got to do: government affairs, advocacy, public relations, research, the event, right? Just to name a few things on how associations really, I believe, are the true single source of truth. They're the credible foundation by which standards have been based. And I'm wondering if you're trying to create that differentiator within the marketplace, is it hard from a learning standpoint, or even from other aspects of saying, hey, the School Nutrition Association is the standard, right? We have set those standards, but you have all those other companies out there saying, you don't need to belong to an association, right? We can do it for you cheaper and the like. Are you kind of seeing that at a certain, like a younger career age versus the members who have been with SNA for, say, 10, 12 years? Are they still renewing, or are you starting to see a drop off across all the demographics?
Thankfully, we are seeing younger people joining. We have a lot of people that maybe started out like, registered dietitians that maybe started out in the clinical side, who found schools and see, obviously, I talked about a mission-based organization focused on our members who feed kids, but the people then who see that they're having a direct impact on kids and what they're eating in this country. So I think for younger, altruistic, that younger generation, millennials, Gen Z, they really like that, and that's important to them. So in being part of a community, I think that's one of the differentiators, and that's why having webinars or abilities for people to get on and engage and coffee chats and things like that, I think people really want that, and they want to learn from one another. There's big challenges out there, and I think it's important as an association also to give that the members can then, like for instance in schools, there's 14,700 some odd school districts, but no one school district is like. But people who in like very large districts, they have similar challenges. So they want to be able to meet, or the, small rural districts, and that you're giving them opportunities to do that sort of thing and engage and learn with like-minded people who are facing those same challenges and whose learning needs may be the same, I think is how an association, again, is innovating and finding those ways to meet members' needs head on.
Yeah, and I'm really glad to hear that. That's why I'm still a big, now again, I know I'm dating myself, but I'm a big proponent of in-person meetings.
Me too.
I often say that associations were the original social network, right? Remember before that you had to get together and you met and you learned from each other and had, coffee chats, and then, in the aisles between booths or, breakout sessions that you really can't get online. And that's why I think it's so important, for the younger generation to understand that still has an impact, right? That can still,
absolutely,
right? And you develop relationships and the like. And
it's a different experience too. Yeah. And we're fortunate coming out of the pandemic. A lot of associations have seen a decrease in attendance at their meetings, ours, we're hitting the highest numbers ever on some of our meetings. Now, this year, we've seen a little bit of a dip. I think it has to do with the finance, what's going on.
Yeah.
First of all, obviously we all see what's happening with, airfares,
Mhm.
right? And the cost of travel to get any place, cost of food, hotels, everything is going up. Also, there was a lot of money that was pumped into school districts during the pandemic and post pandemic so that they could afford and pay for people to come to meetings and stuff. We're kind of seeing a little bit of a pullback right now. As from our business, food costs have increased,
Yeah.
and the cost of putting on meetings. We've all had to increase our reg fees, and that's what makes me nervous. How do you keep the meeting affordable that our members could keep coming? That is the big key. And AV costs, food costs, and that's a challenge going ahead. And I worry about that. But I think people really do get so much more versus yes, did the virtual meeting work? Does it work for a webinar? But think about during COVID when we were on meetings, you'd have a meeting for 3 hours, you're there, and then you'd take a break and come back on and stuff. You did it because we didn't have a choice, but I don't think any of us is the way we want to learn or engage with people.
I agree. And the one thing I've often found out being, as an association executive and participating with boards of directors, oftentimes membership and the board don't really understand how expensive it is to run an association. And I think in this day and age too, I think it's more important. I'm going to ask you to lean on us, but I think the association has to lean more and more on its suppliers, on its sponsors, because I feel that we're all in this together and our livelihood depends on it. And so
yes,
they need folks coming to the show, they being the exhibitors and the sponsors.
Yep.
And I think we have to be more open-minded, and D2L does do this. We have to be more open-minded of, we come to the directors and the CEOs and say, how can we help? What can we do? Now, we're already sponsoring, but what else can we do? Because we can't see this fail, either the organization fail or the event fail. And so I think sponsors are starting to recognize that. And I'm wondering, through the course of all this, where you're starting to see these teens and there's a bit of an angst, how are you rethinking revenue models? I mean, are you starting to say, looking at membership dues and I'm telling you, it's a fiduciary responsibility of an association to meet its expenses. So you can't necessarily reduce member dues or reduce registration fees because those are going to cover the cost of putting the show on. And if we make a little profit, that's great. We put it back into the organization to provide products and services. So are you in the board? Are you in the staff? Because you have a great staff, Patti. You put together
I am blessed. I do have a great team.
Are you spending some time saying, hey, what are some strategic innovations or ways?
We've had to. I mean, and more like, where you spend your money on and what you do. I mean, one of the things we used to put on a big, instead of having an opening event, which I always loved ASAE's opening event, a way of gathering people. Our organization has a closing concert. And of course, I don't have to tell you what it costs to bring anybody group that you've heard, on the radio or music that we all like to hear. And so this year we kind of flipped it and we're having an opening event. And instead of we're going to Charlotte, so we'd have the NASCAR Hall of Fame. There's some cost there, but it's not the same as the staging and the security and all the costs you have in bringing, musicians in and setting up and et cetera. But in our industry, people were more interested in that because once the food show is over, they all get on a plane to go home, right? Because they do these travel the country doing shows.
Yep.
So most of them don't stay. They're happy because we're doing something opening. And I have 6 sponsors this year, which last year we couldn't get anyone to sponsor because none of them stick around.
Right.
But we reduced our costs. So then that's helping us other places where the AV and the other costs are going up. So you're constantly having to rethink and look at putting on a meeting. How do you make it engaging? We're going to have some food trucks there and some fun and interesting things for people to do. And then for people to, see each other, connect. Because sometimes you go to a conference, it's hard. You have a conference with 4,000 or 5,000 people. How do you, unless you go to certain education sessions, you go to a general session room, how do you connect with everyone? We're hoping that this helps connect people more. And again, those are the kinds of things we're constantly looking at to see what we can do to innovate our meetings.
Yeah, and it varies city by city. I mean, if no one's put on an event, cities can be expensive.
Yes.
You know, and we know that. And that's why I think the more and more the board and the vendors can really understand what it's taking to keep our organization going. And I believe it's incumbent upon them to also promote membership. It can't
Oh, absolutely.
right?
It's a team effort. And we're lucky, our industry people, and they're like our ambassadors, because they're the only people in the ecosystem. They're going to schools, they're going to school districts. So they're seeing the members all the time. So I even depend on them to tell me what you're seeing. How's staffing going? What are the trends? What are you seeing out there? And so our industry partners are critical for that. But I think, promoting membership, but what I try to do also, because they don't see our side of the business, even, my members, they buy food and they employ people and equipment, right? And that their budget is very different than ours and how we make our money. So that's part of our new board orientation. We go over our budget and explain our funding and how we bring in the money and why we have to charge what we do. And I even use that for our industry partners. I try to explain, we had to increase, but coming out of the pandemic, we had to go up because AV and food costs and things are increasing. I think that helps us, so they don't, think we're trying to gouge, because there's people out there think, well, why are you just doing this to do it? And I don't have to mention everyone's labor costs coming out of the pandemic, healthcare costs, all those things. So I think it's important that all the members understand the cost of running the business and why we have to make the changes. And then, of course, we all know tech costs and AI now. That's a whole new thing. I think I was happy when we used to spend $400,000 or $500,000 a year on tech. I wish I could say that now, but it's just getting expensive, and I worry it all kinds of comes together and the budget comes together. But I worry at some point it's just not going to be affordable anymore. So
yeah, and I've talked to a bunch of associations across different verticals, from food, healthcare, construction, engineering, and it's kind of consistent across. Everyone's seeing that decrease, and I think one of the reasons may be is that yes, costs are going up. Food costs, like you said, hotel, airfares, and what's not going up is their salary or the budgets, and it's very, very complicated. And I think a natural default is to say, the board's going to say, hey, Patti, why don't we think about doing something hybrid? Or let's think about doing something on a digital format, which by and large is fine, but it doesn't create that same level of impact that being in person can. And that's why I think it's going to be incumbent upon the vendor community, the exhibitors and suppliers, to help offset those costs even more than they're doing now.
Yeah.
And
well, we've been fortunate, we have a foundation. So some of our industry have stepped up and have sponsored scholarships. So, for our annual conference, I think I'd probably give out 50, 60 scholarships that range in from anything from $1,000 up to $2,000. That really could help, but we're having industry sit up and sponsor kind of scholarships for meetings, which is really, really helpful. I'm very appreciative that they're doing that kind of thing, because it also shows that they're investing in people's futures. So, and I think that to get younger people to come to the conferences as well. So we're happy to see that.
And Patti, the School Nutrition Association also has, there's the national, but then there's also at the state levels, right? Like New York and some others, right?
Yep. They all have conferences too.
Yeah. And I'm sure they're probably feeling that same pinch.
They really are. And it's tough. And what's really interesting, because our meetings always over a weekend, because people who work in schools have to be there. So there's always over the weekend, but those industry suppliers who are bringing younger salespeople, those younger people don't want to travel on weekends.
Yeah. Oh,
they don't want to be away. So that I'm like, wow. And it's something you and I grew up with, right? You did it. You had a meeting, you went on a weekend. It was part of it. They're not willing to do it. And then, school districts are cutting back, or even people are looking for more balance. That's another thing coming out of the pandemic. People is not this go, go, go constant. And even one of the things we did, but nobody really used it, but we had like a wellness room. So if somebody needed to get away and step away, in fact, we had put a sign on the door. It's not for people to get on cell phone calls, right? It's for people to go there and to sort of like, get a minute or two by themselves and relax. And, you're doing all these things because people are really, I think, the stress that we have, every day because of what's happening in our world that is spinning and spinning. And for a lot of people, they need that time to take a break and step away. And so again, these are all things that every company in America is dealing with today.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And are you seeing any, like, I guess any, desire or the membership asking for more, like everyone's talking about this digital transformation? Are they saying, hey, we'd like to see, the school nutrition do, kind of be more digital, be more online, be more virtual?
We do webinars and we're very highly successful at webinars, but our members don't pay for webinars because there's so many advocacy organizations and other, nonprofits that work in child nutrition, obviously want to promote, whether it's a hunger organization or a wellness organization. And so we don't charge for those. So, we always have done webinars. We've introduced advocacy is big in our world because we get federal funding is what feeds the kids in this country. The United States spend about $25 billion a year in feeding kids in schools around the country. And so our members, we need them to go and advocate, go to the Hill, promote their programs to senators and congressmen. So we've introduced these advocacy and action updates monthly. We never did this monthly. We did it like once a year, but when we released our position paper, but we're getting people coming. They love to hear what's happening and we're doing things like that. But the whole digital thing is hard. Recently had a member say, due to the increase in cost because of, the war, and are you going to be having a virtual component to your annual meeting? Well, one, I don't have the staff to do that. We did that when we opened our first conference in January 2022. The pandemic was just happening and the Omicron virus was just, over the holidays. If you remember, everything exploded over the holidays that year. We had to go forth with our conference because the hotel wouldn't let us out. We would have lost $800,000 because right then the pandemic was over. We were afraid that we might have to cancel it. So we prepared that we recorded pre-sessions and then hosted the next week coming out of the conference. We had a virtual version of the conference. And let me tell you something, that was a lot for, a small staff. But then I only had like 40 people on staff because I had to make some reductions in force during the pandemic. But the cost to put on a conference virtually with a full in-person meeting that has 7,500 people are so costly that my members don't have the money to pay for it.
Right.
They don't. They simply, and you feel bad, and you have to look at the economics of being able to do something like that. And I would love to say we could do it. And also when we did a virtual conference, annual conference where we had online exhibitors, our members didn't like it. We did it and we didn't make a lot of money, but we put something on and people didn't like it. And part of it is people working in schools, they constantly, they're prepping the food in the morning and then they got to feed. And if, you've got people in the East, middle of the country and the West Coast, the time during the day, what's the best time to do it? So there's all kinds of challenges in doing it. But, we are doing more digitally, a lot of putting, a lot of information on the web, toolkits, things like that, producing materials, our magazine, whatever we can do. What we're having success, and you're probably doing this, is we're starting to record all the sessions and giving a meeting summary coming out of the session. And people just love that. And now we want to take all this sessions and content to create new training based on the different sessions we're having is the next area where we're going to be exploring in the coming months. So,
yeah. And I was going to say too, are you seeing one of the things we're seeing, as you might know, D2L has a very large presence in the K-12 community as well as in the association.
Yeah.
And one of the things we're seeing through some surveys that we're not conducting, but we're looking at is that education or advancing one's career is one of the main reasons they want to join an organization to get
Oh,
smarter,
yes.
right?
Hmm.
And particularly that younger generation. I think when I was getting into the industry, I wanted to go there to network, to meet, right? Now I think there's a bit of a shift where they want to be trained properly. They want to get the badges or the certifications or the micro credentialings.
Yes.
Are you doing a lot of that now at SNA throughout the year?
Yeah, we have a credentialing program, which we actually just moved our exam online. We moved to Pearson View. We used to have hosted at our conferences or at state conferences, and so we moved that online because that younger generation, and we have more people, and it's cheaper for them. And instead of having to travel someplace, they can go and take the tests and so on and so forth. So we're doing that, but we are finding, yes, people want to learn more. But it's the education, it's the learning. Any HR survey you see is what employees, yes, we all want a decent salary, but people want that professional development. Again, I think, let's face it, we're all hearing about AI and what it could do to jobs and stuff. I think people want, to learn those skills and diversify their skills and be the best they can be. And let's face it, there's a many more opportunities today than when you and I first started out in this industry. So
Yeah.
good for them.
One of the things we're seeing from a lot of associations and, through our K through 12 and even higher ed is upskilling. And so upskilling is so important because what's happening, particularly with AI, is the industries are looking for someone to take that lead, right? To say, show me where the future is going and what do I need to know within my industry to be successful, particularly AI. And I think they're looking for the association to be that person, but yet associations are saying, hey, we're still trying to figure it out too, as an organization and how best to do that. But we're starting to see, and this is interesting, that learning and education is really a strategic driver. In other words, this is something that says, hey, we are that. How does the school nutrition, how do you kind of position yourself within the industry? Because I think other associations say, how do we establish ourselves as the standard, as that single source of truth? How do you, and I guess that's a bit of advocacy.
We always say we're the voice of school nutrition, right? We say we are in various ways. And, people would think you're going, we feed kids. So people would think, well, your education programs is maybe about nutrition or food safety. But one of the most successful meetings we have is what we called our School Nutrition Industry Conference. And we've had, in this past year, we had speakers come on AI, and talk about the futurist and doing things like that, because I feel like we have a responsibility. They know that stuff, right? They can, they could go online and, and we do provide training on all that as well. But what they need to see is how the world is changing and what's going on, latest in technology and what is happening out there and what's the future hold. And, we found a lot of success with that. And people, especially that younger generation, the technology and stuff, they want that high level, next level speaker.
Yeah.
And you combine it with, subject matter experts. So you pair it, you get some members who are using AI or using social media to promote their operations and drive participation in school meals. Because it's a business. At the end of the day, they're running businesses just like I am. And, they have to cover their expenses. They're supposed to cover their expenses. So they have to drive that participation. Yes, they get, kids, families who can't afford to pay for school meals. There's, free meals for kids, but they need to have the paying student as well to be able to cover the expenses. Again, food costs, labor costs, everything is increasing for these programs as well. So we find members, especially that younger generation, and our industry members really are looking for high level speakers on a vast majority of topics and things that are happening out there in the world.
Yeah. Do you, as an organization, does your education come outside of member dues? In other words, are you charging for courses and certification?
We charge some for courses. We actually did like everybody else. Like when you go to your annual conference, you pick out 20 sessions that are really popular topics and record, and you spend like $20,000. You do all the editing, and then you turn around and put it out there, and people don't want it. They're not willing to spend our money because they don't have there's only so much a school district has. So, we want them to pay money on, our memberships and pay money to come to our big conferences and things like that. Plus, again, there are so many other people out there that are offering free education, or an industry person, is doing some education, working with chefs and, different things like that to highlight their products. So
Yeah. The reason I asked that is I've been seeing that too. We go across the country and do little get-togethers with association executives talking about challenges and opportunities. And one of them has been the fact that they feel that they have to give away everything for free because they want to keep the membership, right? And that's when we have the discussions of, nonprofit doesn't mean free, right? Because we do have typically, associations are funded through initially through member dues, but that's to keep staff and rent and all the insurance you need to run it so that you can produce these wonderful products and services to advance your industry. But those cost. And so one of the things we've been seeing is members saying, how do we go from zero, like charging nothing, to either bundling or providing some educational assets beyond the membership due, because that does cost us money and we kind of have to recuperate that so we can continue to provide that. And there's been surveys. I don't know if you know Jeff Cobb from Tagoras, but he does he does some great
he does
research. And one of the ones that he was doing, talking about kind of the learning becoming more of a strategy than a program. And when it's a strategy, it involves every aspect of the organization. Within the school, within your organization, School Nutrition Association, is everyone, I know it's tough because it was tough for me, but is everyone kind of all part of the understanding the value that learning plays within our organization, and everything we do must have a little bit of that learning?
Oh, I think so. Well, we have a strategic framework, and it's one of our 4 areas of focus, is professional development and learning. So yes, it is. It's like you said, you do want to charge, but you got what's that price point?
Yeah.
That's going to work. It's going to be affordable, but you also got to look at the cost. It's budgeting time, right? So we're sitting here and someone said, "Oh, we saw this new cool thing we want to do, blah, blah, blah." And I said, "Well, what is the cost though? And does the cost justify it, or is what we're using currently going to do it?" That's the key now. I think all of us have to look at, because how much, certain technologies cost a lot more money, and you got to look at what the price of the product and what you're going to be able to provide the member at that certain price point. So, like everybody else, we have to look at the overall cost of producing this stuff.
Yeah. And what oftentimes members and board members sometimes forget is that when you launch something new, you're also reallocating staff time away from something else, and that costs money. That person's being paid. And so we have to take all that into consideration. And that's why I think sometimes it's important for boards to say, hey, it takes a lot of revenue to keep SNA going, or whatever your organization is. So you have to understand that things are going to start going up, because again, nonprofit doesn't mean free. It's just a tax status, not a business model. And so
it's important also for boards. Like if we're doing something new, we go and that money comes out of reserve. We say reserves is there. Yes, God forbid that rainy day, but that's our R&D fund as well. So the board have to, you try to explain in a for-profit world, think of all the new product testing and things that go on, but something may never make it to market. We don't have that luxury. Whatever we do is going to go to market, right? But it may not take, right? You're going to have to test it. And then at some point, if it's not, people aren't purchasing it and they're not finding it useful, then you're going to have to cut it. You're going to have to cut the strings and say, okay, this is not going to work. But I think it's important as part of your strategic discussions with the board that they understand that. Otherwise, I think, you could get yourself into some trouble. I think you need to be very transparent with the board, even about the costs and everything, and, what it takes to run the organization. I go back to that. Sometimes somebody asked me, is your goal to make money every year? Because we're a nonprofit. I said, well, we have to make money, yes, because we have to be able to reinvest in the business. You just can't, come in, you're a $14.5 million organization and just hope to make $10,000 a year, because you need to have the money down the road. And of course, during the pandemic, it's what got us through. We were lucky because we had the right insurance. We had bought the insurance to cover our meetings when they got canceled. But we didn't have to take a lot of money out of reserves. We had to make some cuts on staff, but we got through it. But I don't think a lot of people realize that, you're a business, and no matter what business you're in today, your costs are so high that you have to factor in to make a profit in order to reinvest in the company and to keep up with what's happening out there in the world today.
Yeah, and it's maddening at times, I think, for staff, particularly those who are working with the board and so forth, because the fact is that, do you want to work with an organization that is not making money, is just breaking even? Because then you can't grow, right? Right, and so it's kind of, that's why I think there becomes a bit of a fiduciary responsibility of board members to take a more active role, and we're starting to actually see, in working with boards, because when an organization is looking at a learning management system, sometimes they want to bring the board in, at least some of the folks on the executive committee, just to make sure, because it's a big investment, and they're like, and they're starting to look at that. And one of the things that they're asking too is, hey, will this, and I've been saying, I want to take the word relevant out of my vocabulary for this year and use impact. We always wanted the association to be relevant, but are you making an impact? And I think one of the best ways to make impact is learning. And I don't mean this by just taking a course, but learning is going to going to the annual event and talking with people over lunch. You're learning what's happening in their industry. And are you trying to see that? I mean, are you seeing that right now, that learning or education is going to be that impactful type of offering that we as an organization need to really promote more and more of and dedicate more and more resources to?
Well, we are, and I do think so, yes, especially since people are feeling, again, they're worried about their jobs, right? So what better way than, especially, and I think even teaching members about AI and how they can use what I would like to see us start focusing on in the coming months is how they can use AI to help them. Just like, we all could, I could use another 15 people on staff if I could afford them, right? Same thing in schools, right? And there's just so much demand out there, but teaching them how to use AI, I think is really important. So whatever we can do, but I think, again, promoting this constant, you look at how quickly technology, and even like, what is it? They said a year ago, people here in DC and about AI and how far it's come. And I think it's a little scary, right? At how quickly the pace is in learning and everything that's evolving with AI. But I think more important than ever, and especially to get staff. And I think, quite honestly, I have a fiduciary duty to ensure my staff is getting trained in AI. Because I worry about, we introduced Copilot, and at first, we're saying, you could opt in, and we put out the opt-in notice, opt-in to opt out right before the holiday, and we came back and they said to me, well, we had, how many people signed up? And they said, well, about 14 or 15 didn't. And I got, I feel like, why didn't somebody sign up? I go, that's not right. You need to go double check with people. I think they were busy trying to get everything, because we closed down between Christmas and New Year's. So they wanted to get everything done before closing down, because I worry, especially for that younger generation, we owe it to them so that they will be able to, especially people like coordinator level and stuff, that they'll be able to have the skill sets to be employed, that they can continue to grow. So I feel not just for our members, but I feel an obligation to my staff that we have to help them do that as well.
I think that's so nice to hear, because oftentimes we've seen some statistics that are showing a lot of churn within the association space of staff leaving, and no one really understands, if you have a staff of 10, I know you have a larger staff than that, but if you have a staff of 10 and 2 people leave, you've lost 20% of your staff, and just trying to replace them is not easy, because that momentum that they've created, it almost takes a year and a half just to catch up to where they were.
It does. Although I will say, as coming out of the pandemic, people were hiring like crazy, and you couldn't find people. This is the first time in 6 years I'm almost fully staffed. I have one position that's about to be filled. I have not been fully staffed even before COVID. We couldn't find people in the DC region. It's just so competitive for in our field, as you know, and there are a lot of large associations, but it's definitely starting to turn. But I do think it's, again, you need to keep, if you want to keep good people, you got to keep train them. You got to provide them professional development, and you got to keep them challenged. And I think with AI, and it's, a lot of people, in fact, today I just got back from vacation in Europe. So I'm a little bit waking up a little bit too early, and I'm still on Europe time. So I found myself reading the Wall Street Journal this morning very early in bed, and on my iPad. And it's the backlash against AI. I get it, but I just think, I think maybe the government or someone has to do to educate people more on what the opportunities and what it can mean in our lives. And I think nobody's really doing a good job at that. Even all these AI companies are spending money. They got to do a better job, because I do think it really can do a lot for our country and for young people today.
Oh, I agree. In fact, Financial Times had a statistic that says job skills have changed 25% since 2015, right? So that,
oh, wow.
Now they're saying they're going to change by 65%, almost 2/3 within the next 4 years by 2030. And a lot of that's going to be due to AI, right? And I think, and I know the younger generation says, yeah, blah, blah, blah. I've heard this before. We saw the web come into being a disruptor within the association space.
Oh, yes.
And I remember, and I was one of them saying, thinking, no one's going to put their credit card online to buy the registration. They're not going to, they're not going to want to miss a meeting because they can do it over the computer. And look at what's happened over that. And I think with AI, it's going to be exponentially faster.
I was just yes, it is. It already is. It's just trying to, and for someone like me who has, with all the responsibilities, I go in, I use AI, but I'm not real good at going and doing the co-pilot training. In fact, I got to do a little bit of that this week. I'm a little behind in doing it. I just started using it and finding ways to use it, but probably I'd be better off if I did some of the co-pilot training. So,
yeah, that's the thing. And again, I think that fear is waning a little bit, that AI can replace me. What it can replace is mundane tasks that can make you more efficient and more effective. And I think that it also is a catalyst accelerator. It helps you think differently, but it can't have the conversation with your member. Right.
It's true.
And it might be able to anticipate certain things based on data, but it's not going to replace the human interactions that I think members come to appreciate and expect. It can maybe enhance it a little bit. And this kind of touches on something that there's this buzzword out there, this future proofing of associations. I don't know how you future proof, but you're trying to look ahead and say, we want to be on the top of the technology wave, or here's where the future's going. And we're trying to remain impactful, not real, but impactful. I'm sure there's some strategy thinking of, not only are we doing the day-to-day stuff here at SNA, but we're trying to say, this is where we kind of see the future going with AI as it relates to school nutrition. And we just want to inform our members that this is coming. Are you doing some of that to try and be a little bit forward thinking, which is difficult?
We have some sessions. We have some sessions planned for our coming conferences coming, and our speakers are going to touch on a little bit of that, paid speakers. But we're starting now to plan for our meeting in January, my industry conference, which is, we call it the industry conference because it's, basically innovative. It's the kind of the innovation meeting we have every year for the K-12. When I say industry, it's the K-12 segment. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to have to focus on that and do a little bit a better job at that to help people. You see a lot of stuff, in restaurants, and you see what's happening. Like, they're weighing plates or have sensors because the food costs, if they can weigh a plate, and if it's over so many ounces, they know they have too much food on the plate. Or robots or, salad makers or something in schools. I don't see that kind of technology hitting schools so quickly because of the cost. They just don't have the money. Schools need money to buy more equipment. The equipment, let's face it, we all buy a refrigerator, dryer. They're not lasting 20 years anymore, right? Same thing in schools. And then I hear about the cost to have anybody even walk in the door to fix something today, what they have to pay. Again, more cost coming to their business. But, that adaptation is going to come. But I think we have an obligation to bring to them and to teach them and show them how to, streamline what they do. They have a lot of manual, every job. Let's face it, every job has all those manual tasks. And we have an obligation to help them to make their jobs more manageable. These people's jobs, I think about over the last 15 years, the changes and, driving to have healthier meals and, just, the applications for kids to have to fill out an application to get approved to get a free meal and just all the regulations and stuff. Minutia is what I call, right? Really, that AI and things that could help streamline those processes, that they could really focus in. Some of my members get into it and love to go into the cafeteria and see the kids and, interact with their staff, but they're tied to their desks because of all that administrative work that all of us have in our jobs. Right. I think that's where AI can really help streamline a lot of that.
Yeah. When they, one of the other things too, that I think might be an opportunity for associations, and maybe SNA is doing this, but when, all association from the staff standpoint, we always want to make sure, hey, our LMS is working fine. Our members love the engagement. They give it high marks and there's a high completion rate. That's great. And so the staff is like, hey, we've done it. This is great. But are you actually tracking the impact that learning and education, that certification is helping in their career as they go on, the personal aspect? Because I think what happens is most associations I've talked to are saying, no, we don't track that.
We have not. Yeah. Only by people's testimonies. It's a great story, especially you hear people who, started out working in the kitchen. Maybe somebody was a single mother or mother, started working part-time 4 hours, and then they rise up and, they have to take certain food safety and nutrition courses. But you could, rise up and it's, even at a small school district, you might not have a full 4-year degree, but you could get a pretty nice, job in the community working and feeding kids. That can still happen today. And I think, again, the kind of learning and education that an association can put out and provide could really be valuable, especially when you look at the cost of what to go to college is today. Many people, younger people, they're wondering, is that really a good investment for me to be spending all this money to go to college? Where I think it will be an opportunity for associations moving forward.
Oh, I think so too, because not only that, but you're taking on a rather large debt that can take tens, if not 20 years to pay off. And I think they're starting to look at more effective learning and educational experiences where I can get a certification in advance without having to spend an enormous amount of money.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think associations are uniquely positioned. And maybe I don't know, looking through rose-colored glasses, but I'm a huge proponent of, associations being designed and will always be designed to protect, promote, and advance an industry, because we have the subject matter experts in there and they're promoting that too. And so I just think too, one of the shifts that are starting to happen is we're all in this together now. Used to be, it was like the board and the staff, and we move forward, and then the suppliers would, come along and be that. Now we're all in this together. We don't want to see anything fail. And I think it's incumbent upon the board of directors, not the staff so much anymore, to really promote the goodness of the organization and the critical nature it has. And the products and services an association has, like learning, you can trust this information because it's vetted, it's complete, and it's trusted before we send it out. These other, some of these other competitive companies how do you know that's the standard? They're probably stealing from SNA to provide those standards. So just in closing, Patti, and this has been one of the fastest hours of the month. Where do you kind of see, SNA is its role in particularly serving this younger generation and helping them, kind of guiding them through the industry and the aspects that an organization should provide, such as learning and networking and research and the like? How is SNA really going to position itself in the next 3 to 5 years to say we are that single source of truth?
I think it's we have an obligation. I think it's a fiduciary obligation, as whether it's, a staff person or the board, to provide that for people that, want to come in, especially given the nature of the work. They're responsible for feeding, our nation's future.
Mhm.
And you read in the news about Make America Healthy Again. Most Americans believe in healthier eating, healthier food. And there's a new dietary guidelines. The pyramid, pyramid's been flipped, right?
Yep.
Everybody's reading and hearing
Yep.
about that. Well, they are now the first place where people are going to start seeing that. Some new proposed rules are going to be coming out from USDA, and my members will have to implement those. Once the rules finalize, it's probably, in the next year and a half, 2 years, but preparing them to be able to do that. And like you said, saying you're the trusted source of information to ensure that you're continuing to feed kids these healthy meals so they could, learn and to be, nurture them and help them learn and be the best they can be.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're at the end, but I do want to thank you. I had 3 children go through the school district, and they all ate very healthy, never got sick. So I can't thank you enough for you and your members for making my children's day at school a little bit more healthy and invigorating. You've been listening to Learning by Association, a podcast where we delve into the ever-evolving world of associations and the challenges they face in navigating the currents of change. This episode was produced by D2L, a global learning innovation company helping organizations reshape the future of education and work. To learn more about our solutions, please visit www.d2l.com. And don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date with new episodes. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.